Hey, what's up, everybody? Hello, folks. Welcome. Let me know in the chat. Can you see us okay? Can you hear us okay? The usual greeting that I should probably find a cooler way to say that after however many streams. Oh my gosh, very exciting seeing some comments in the chat. Dr. Flapjack himself says, "I'm here in hopes that Mike tells us about how their bones are their money?" Question mark. So, got some got some folks in the chat. We love it. You hear us loud and clear. Welcome everybody. Very excited to be here with our special guest. My name is Lana Bachynski. I am an associate art director here at Riot, working in R&D. Here with another rat.
Hey, I'm Skylar. I've been on here a lot. I'm principal animator, also working in R&D at Riot. On Lana's team.
Woo! And we are here for one of many rat streams that we've had in a row. We are trying to push to affiliate, so you'll probably see more of these coming down the road. But we're here today to talk about animation direction, and we have an amazing special guest with us, the one and only Mike Jungbluth. Can we get rats in the chat for Mike? Woo! Yow! Mike Jungbluth, animation director at Compulsion Games. I want you to introduce yourself. Tell us more about you. Why don't you start off with that? I mean, I can talk about how we know each other and like why exactly we're doing this, but I think it'd be best to just have folks hear from you themselves.
All right. So about me. Yep. So I'm at Compulsion Games. We're making South of Midnight. We showed a trailer last summer. That's really exciting. It's very animation goodness. Before that, I've been around. I've been in games since 2006. Worked on a bunch of different titles, some first-person stuff at Raven Software, some worked at Elder Scrolls Online, did some stuff on Shadow of Mordor. So worked on a bunch of different things, a bunch of different studios, and also throughout that time, started the GDC Animation Bootcamp, which is now the Summit. From there, we grew the Animation Exchange, all of which was around really trying to get to a point where how do we make game animation, interactive animation? There was always been a lot of behind the scenes and documentaries and things around how like films are made and shorts and sort of that sort of application of animation. But what happens when you have to press buttons and it has to react to player input or to AI pathing and all of those sort of things and all the real-time requirements. There was less of that. So that was really what I found was as I was at different studios making a bunch of different types of games, everyone was going about it slightly differently, some ways better than others. As we would bring in people through GDC and the Animation Exchange, we would hear how they were doing it, all to really try and get to a point of how do we make these things so that we can get to the point of what are they doing, why are they doing it, all of this stuff that I find really interesting in creating a character performance and like art and aesthetic and craft and tone behind all of these things. But when you push the stick forward, let's make sure they're not going left, because that still happens all the time. So that's kind of the high level, which then led to me writing a book about animation direction.
And that is like really the key inspiration behind our discussion here today. Mike's book is called Directing Game Animation. And I want to be clear, our conversation here is talking about it. It's inspired by the book. We're not here shilling for the book, though. Let me tell you, you should buy it. Tons of great information. There it is. Tons of great information in that thing. I personally have used it a ton to help calibrate my team, Skylar, and our other animators into like sort of seeing the same vision and executing on that same vision. It is excellent. But speaking of interactive, this is a conversation. It's going to be a largely an interview sort of discussion format between the three of us. But I got the chats up on the screen. Please hit me up. If you have questions, make sure you @RatAnimators in the chat so I can catch it. And I will make sure that your questions get answered by our discussion today. But where I want to start off is talking a bit about the book. You talked a little bit about the foundation there, like why you decided to write about these things. The book dives into the foundation of like what is animation direction, but could you sort of start with like your personal take on what animation direction is for the chat, just so we all calibrate right away, being on the same page about what we're talking about today?
Yeah, so one of the things that I found whenever somebody moves into a role of animation direction or even an animation lead, any sort of animation leadership, what do you do? Where do you start? What is a vision? How do you build a team? What is style? I don't know. Like there's sort of all of these different possibilities of what it could be that you need to focus on. And so really the point of the book is, one of the things that I bring up is that there's this quote that I heard from the sound engineer who had said, any creative direction is listening to your head, your heart, and your gut and finding that balance. And so really for me, this book is, okay, you're in this role. How do you like listen to your head, your heart, and your gut and find that? And so it's really sort of a breakdown from the, hey, you just started this project fresh. You don't know anybody on the team. What do they expect of you? All the way to, what type of performance we want from the characters. What's the style going to be? How do you communicate that to the team, that people that know nothing about animation, and really that whole stretch of stuff, so that ideally when somebody takes on this sort of role or thinks about wanting to get into this sort of role, there's a place to find that out, because it's not really been documented anywhere. Super niche.
Yeah, definitely. And it is so important. I feel like it's something that, like, understanding, like, oh, well, the difference between, like, what's the animation lead versus animation director. Skylar, you are not an animation director, but you are a high-level animator. And you actually said something to me once that I thought was very striking, of, like, being on a project where there is explicit animation direction and, like, sort of the difference that is made. Do you want to talk a little bit about, like, why you think animation direction as a concept is important?
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, I've been on a lot of projects at Riot, but I've also worked at least on one other project outside of Riot. And I think my experience, honestly, on almost every project I've worked on is that art direction, and specifically animation direction, has been pretty light. I would say, I kind of worked on League of Legends sort of early on in its life cycle, more in the like 2012 to 2014 era. And it was a little bit of the wild, wild west as far as, like, each character, you get each character and you'd be like, what's the animation style that works for this character? Less than like, what is the style for League of Legends? That's definitely changed over time, but at least not while I was there. And there is some like joy to that as an animator, of that, just sort of like everything's open-ended and it's all up to you. But there's also a little bit of like stress to it too, when there's no bounds on anything. And I think that we'd all agree that, like, early on, League of Legends didn't feel like a unified product. It was like a bunch of animators doing like what they found exciting. And like I said, while there was something exciting about that as an animator, I think that, having bounds is like, I think a lot of people find it like restricting to have bounds, but I think when you're trying to create a cohesive project, it's just really important to have some box you're working within. And I think I brought that up when I was talking about our current project, in that it just felt really nice to have some guidance, because, and it's simple things like, oh, animation review turns into like, oh, we can talk about animations using these like sort of 5 stakes we have in the ground about what our animation should be. And it's not just like, what is good animation? And us like philosophizing about like, what is good animation to each individual, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I've been in a lot of teams where that's what animation reviews were, was just like, not people arguing, but people like really like on their soapbox, like each review, evangelizing their thing that they care about in animation. For me, it was always arcs. I'm like, your arcs, get your arcs good. And then maybe it's, I don't even know if arcs were like a thing that we should have cared about. I'm like, I don't know. But man, I was in the reviews advocating for good arcs on everything. You know what I mean? Because that's the thing I cared about. Whereas now I feel like some of the things I care about aren't important to our project, but I have like a list of things that I can look at and use as a razor for other people's animations, but also it gives me a razor when working on my own animations to preempt a lot of the review material. And it's funny, I go into, I'm in a stage right now where I'm doing lots of animation, like fast and blocking things out and just kind of doing it quickly and not thinking quite as much about style. But, Lana drives a lot of the style on our project, and I'll often do an animation and be like, I know what she's going to like say about this one. And then I like go to the review and I'm like, yep, already had that note. You know what I mean? Just because like we've talked about the direction enough that I kind of like now know the things that are going to kind of be triggers to change and stuff like that. So
yeah. Big B808 in the chat said, all right, everyone, here's the box we're all working in. I'll call it the sandbox. But I love what you're saying there in that, when it comes to like animation direction, whether you're on a team that you've always been on, like something like League of Legends, finding its style or finding a way to define its style after 10 years, or coming into a team and starting new, there is a lot of expectation setting that you have to sort of make with a team that you're coming into to set those boundaries and also make that okay. When writing this book, Mike, you talked to a ton of people when it came to actually writing this. You, I know, have like a bunch of your personal strategies for animation direction of like getting that to feel okay to start putting those restraints on. Do you want to talk a little bit more about setting those expectations, and how did you do that on your teams, and how did you even find that firm baseline to put it in a book that it would be an accessible touch point for people no matter what type of team they've been on?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that it took me way too long to really appreciate and understand was that as I would move to new teams or new studios, it's easy to sort of come into it and go, okay, this is what I've learned, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm going to do, and you sort of just project that. You say, okay, this is the path. And what I've come to realize over the last couple of projects and teams is flip it. Right? Like the first thing I need to do is sort of come in and go, okay, what are your expectations of the leadership team? Because there's going to be people that, as a director, you work alongside or that you still report to. So it's good to understand, okay, here are some questions that are just general to ask all of them, but then I break down as well, like the questions you ask of a design director are going to be different than the art director in terms of what they expect from animation, but also from an animation director, right? In terms of art is more likely going to be interested in tone and art quality and how it matches their aesthetic. And design is going to be focused on what's the metrics of this thing, and is it going to be responsive and punchy, and am I going to get the quantity of things I want versus the focus on quality and all of those sort of things. So coming in early and asking, okay, what are your expectations on games that have done this well, games that haven't? What are the areas of the game that we're working on that you're either most interested in? Because then you're going to know where you're going to have to be iterating, likely the most. So starting with that is important. Then it's starting and saying, okay, to the team that you're leading and directing, what are their expectations of the role? Because everyone has had different directors, leads, supervisors, and that's influence the way that they expect their manager or their lead or their director, whoever, to operate, right? So, okay, now I've got all their expectations as well. And at that point, you can sort of go, okay, the people I work alongside and report to are going to expect this of me. This is what the team expects. How close are those? Please, hopefully they're very close. If not, then your role is to help pull those together in a way that serves one another. And then third is then finally, okay, what are your actual expectations of the role? Does it match what those are? Because if not, then you're likely either going to need to get excited about those things, or it might not actually be the role for you, because you're kind of setting yourself up to fail if you have to deliver on expectations that you're either not excited about or don't match your actual interest or skill set.
Yeah, I really like those questions for expectation setting, because they are also helpful, like in an interview situation. They're not something that you have to figure out on the job. They are, once you're on the job, things that will help you, I think, hit the ground running if you can immediately identify, where people's hearts, what did you say? Heart, mind, gut.
Head, heart, gut. Yeah.
You can see where other people's head, heart, gut are, and then you can sort of feel your own out once you get into the space. But like before you even take a role like that, because it is high pressure, it can be like very exciting to be like, oh yeah, I get to direct. But like realizing how much of that on a team is actually going to be like in the thick of the craft versus being a very the production centric role, and it could vary wildly depending on the studio. So even if like the title and the role in your head might seem really enticing, that might not actually be your reality when you get to the place that you're going. And again, that could be whether you're coming up internally or coming externally as a candidate. But I find like one of the things I've found in talking with leaders, and one of the things that I think can feel like at odds with what like a strong leader looks like in a role like this, does come down to how many questions that you ask. Because asking questions and not having the implies that you don't have the answers. And I think a lot of people would initially perceive that as like weakness or like an ineptitude in some capacity. But I find like being willing to ask those questions, and importantly, sponging up the answers and really receiving the answers once you get them and acting on it. It's such a boon to your existences as a leader, and showing people that you care about them. They can rely on you to be honest about where you're at. And then also, I'm losing my train of thought as I'm talking. I forget what I'm saying, but I just love that, like, how big of a part of my job feels like it's asking questions all the time, every day, at every possible turn, because it honestly makes other people think about it and makes things better.
Well, and I also just want to say that, like, forget about as a leader. I mean, I think that's good advice for anybody. I think that there's like you sort of mentioned it, but like there's an important piece of that, which I think like a lot of people when they join the industry feel like, oh, they ask questions. Like you said, it's like you're revealing some lack of knowledge or whatever. But the people that I see succeed and learn quickly are the ones who just ask every single thing they don't know how to do. They just ask. I think there's a great animator on our team, Thomas, who like came in and just like asked a million questions about everything, and is now probably like one of the best animators I've worked with, very technical, but didn't have that knowledge coming in and was able to just like absorb it through like every single time something came up. They asked a question. And I think that like that's good advice for anyone at any tier in animation, particularly when joining a new team, is to not assume things or not assume that you understand things, and ask a question, and don't be afraid to like sound stupid. I mean, it's funny. I used to have this like engineer on a previous team that I worked with who was just like the most genius, like animation focused engineer. And she would like talk to me and I wouldn't understand half of what she said, but like you could just like nod along and that she'd like go take care of it. Right. Cause she was like so competent, that she always knew what you were asking for and everything. But I got in the habit of being like, okay, I didn't understand at all what you said. Like, can you explain it to me in a way that I can understand? And she was very willing to do that. I feel like I learned so much from her about like animation systems and how to think about animation, just from being like, I'm too dumb to understand it when you talk in engineering terms. Talk to me in like 5-year-old animator terms, and most people are happy and willing to like teach you. You just got to ask to be taught.
Well, I think what's interesting about that is I think even folks who have that kind of sense often lose it when they move into like more leadership oriented roles where you're guiding other people, because there is some disconnect of expectation. But the same way you can like learn all those engineering things, you can learn about your project, about your needs, about the needs of your team, like all the things that Mike was saying is like you can have that same kind of learning, and it is a different type of technical learning, but it is also social learning and soft skill learning. There's it never stops paying back. So one of the things though that was incredibly helpful for our team, I even thinking about it in advance of this conversation that we're having, I went through and I was like, okay, I'm reading back the section of the book to see what inspired me and the way that I took it to the team, and then how that changed for us and what we got from it. Is I actually, even though I wrote it down, I forgot exactly how you're talking about it in the book, but it's about finding style. And you can ask a lot of questions and hear a lot of answers, but you can still have a hard time knowing that you are seeing, communicating, saying the same words will mean something different to your different teammates, and finding out of nothing, how do you pick a style to make? You're the animation director. How are you direct us now? Can you talk about finding style for the game and for a game that you're working on? And how do you even identify where you want to start, and where do people go from there?
Yeah, so I think that the style chapter was the hardest one to write, in that generally when we talk about animation style, we bring up videos, right? We look at different films, different games, different documentaries, whatever, and we say this is the style. And it's okay, well, you're writing a book, you don't have video, right? You've got to translate what is an aesthetic style of motion time into a static one that is locked in time, right? So that was one where I sort of had to go, okay, what is it that we're trying to do? And I think the first was, well, let's separate. Style can mean two things right up front from people. There's the visual aesthetic style, and then I think there's the tone and the mood style. And so it's important to, okay, let's separate those two things, because those are different. And I started to get, I touched on the tone a little bit, but for me that also starts to get into narrative and character performance and emotion and all of that sort of stuff. So it's let's cover tone as part of that, and look at aesthetic style purely on the art of it, the craft, the look of it. Right? And so that was where I had some initial ideas, but it was okay, I need to start bouncing this around, right? You can't trying to figure it out on your own. You only get so far, and it's good to start saying, well, let me take what I've got it as a base level of I'm thinking of I'm a big fan of different types of charts, right? And I love their coordinate charts, which is just cross on each end. You've got two opposites, right? And then on that graph, you can plot a point and get something. So I knew that, okay, we have abstract and realism. That's an art style that's just understood and pretty clearly defined. But within that, we have more than that for animation, right? Because we have timing and motion. And to me, there was the idea of I knew it was okay, well, you've got simple animation and exaggerated, but at a certain point, simple is still kind of an exaggeration, but also an abstract visual. And so that was where working with you, Lana, and kind of chatting okay, here's what I'm thinking. Let's talk about some ideas, right? And I can't remember. I think it was constrained and boundless or where we ended up. And I know you're responsible for at least one of those words, possibly both. And it was one of those when finding that additional point, that binary of those two was oh, okay, here we go. Now we've got sort of a full space between these things that we can start looking at. And from there, it was okay, well, what is animation elements? And it was timing, posing, and motion. Those three things sort of define the animation style. So if you can chart each one of those three things separately somewhere on that graph, then you can find you can communicate the animation style, But I think what's even more fun, and I think what you did, Lana, and I think what was really helpful was like, okay, everyone, where do you think our style is at? Plot these, and let's see how far apart we are.
So the thing
Love that.
I liked about using those graphs as an activity, I almost felt like it was the model of the universe where you're like, what is it? The scale of the universe, where you start, you can look at it and you can look at it as the atoms and the little protons and electrons, the very teeniest, tiniest version. And you can scale way, 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 way back out and you can look at the entire universe. And I feel like these charts as like a baseline for calibration can help on every level. So like you come into a project, you have no idea what you want to do. Maybe you're an indie team and you're spinning up your studio and you can do anything that you want. The world is your freaking oyster. The animation, I think people are like animation for games, that's people punching. But no, it's not. While animation for games is also, as simple as a sprite moving around. Mario is animated in the originals. It's a 2-frame run cycle, but it's animated, and that's still animation. That could be a style you choose. And like, I think being able to say, hey, here's a bunch of things that we like, and like seeing where they land in this world and then thinking about what's obtainable, great. That's our first snapshot of where we want to take style for the game that we're working on. But one of the things that I think really helped us on our team specifically was not necessarily looking at it from the scale of infinite possibilities, not all the way from constrained to boundless, not all the way from abstract to realism, but saying, okay, here's the types of games that we like. What is it about them? And between all of them, where do they fall on a more zoomed in version of that same kind of scale? So in your book, one of the games that you reference as a chart is Overwatch and Call of Duty, I believe, are the two in the book. And because of their nature, they're both kind of sitting around realism, but like using those same two games as an example. If those are the only two games and it's binary, what's abstract and what's realism? Well, Call of Duty is suddenly really realistic and Overwatch is suddenly way over here on the abstract scale. So one of the things that we did is I sort of presented using these charts to Skylar as like, hey, I think we could use this to start getting alignment in like the language that we use to describe the game that we're at. And then what Skylar, I don't know if you want to talk about sort of like the funnel that you ended up presenting back to me as like how to start broad and get closer and closer to talking about our game. If you even remember.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember back. I mean, the process we used was, I believe at the start, we didn't even like have our game on the charts. What we did instead was we picked out games that we felt could be targets for us. And so the bounds we started with, like you said, was not like the infinite universe. We picked probably like 5 or 6 games that were like in similar genres to us, in similar like tone space to us and all those things. And we took those and we plotted those on the charts we decided first.
Well, we started actually even broader.
Did we?
You were like,
you tell me what I did.
Sorry, you were like,
No.
I went to go do that. And then you started with just games that were completely agnostic to our game. Just games that were stylistically extreme.
You're right. I forgot about that step. Yeah, so we did a very first step that was literally like, just so we could understand how we perceive style. Because here's been one of the problems that I've dealt with in the past when trying to do style exploration with teams is like, you got to have like an anchor point that everybody agrees on. Otherwise, everybody's just coming into it with their subjective interpretation of like what is stylized, right? It's like what you said about when you compare like Overwatch to Call of Duty, like while they're both still like in the grand scheme of the universe, like they're both pretty real, but nobody would like sit down and say that like Overwatch is like a realistic looking game, right? And so, but how unreal is it, right? That's where everybody gets subjective. Some people would think that's like an extremely stylized game, but then when you put it against like, I don't know, like a Ratchet and Clank or Jack and Daxter or something, it's not even really in that realm, right? And so what we did very first was we picked a couple games that we were just like, I think we can all agree that like this game sits here on this chart. And we were like, yeah, right? Like just very obvious ones. And those provided us some like really like high level anchors to start like pinning the actual games that were like references for our game that we were working on around those, because we could be like, oh, well, the posing is definitely less extreme than that game that we all agreed on, right? And that provided us like a nice compass to sort of like build the bounds a little bit smarter once we had these like anchors to sort of build our like web around.
Yeah. And the thing I really liked is in the end, like, as you know, the person who was leading the team, I was animation lead going through this exercise, so I wasn't any director title, but I was, in the end, it didn't necessarily matter that everybody's graphs that we went through, it was like looking at a snapshot of everybody's brain. Some people were really precise. To loop an answer into Deadly Panda 777, do you think style matters more than the technicalities of the animation, like the time and area of the swing for games? We definitely plotted on the graph timing, posing, and motion as 3 separate pieces, which Mike, you do in the book as well, so that like those technicalities, the time of the swing versus the actual motion of the swing versus the posing that you're using for the swing are 3 different concepts that could be a blend of styles that you can pull from different references for each piece. So I think all of those pieces are a piece of the pie that makes up style. So some people would be so precise with where they'd put their dots. One of the animators stacked all their dots and just put all 3 of them around everywhere, and seeing just that perception of like, oh, this is what matters to you. It like helped me understand better to how to communicate with that animator, because I could see, oh, this is how your brain works. You don't really care about these little things. You care about the whole. What does the whole feel like? So that was like a great learning experience for me to go through, not just with the animators, but we also had our art director in there and our game director and a couple of our key design collaborators all participating. And at the end, we were able to talk about where our game is currently versus where we want the game to be. And somebody, can we ask me to speak closer to the mic? Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll talk. I don't want to. Sorry, Mike and Skylar, if I'm blowing your eardrums out, but.
No, you're good.
Okay, great. I am going to.
I mean, what'd you say?
Sorry. I'll talk louder. Thanks for the comment. So it was not just a fascinating exercise, but so helpful. And at the end, it didn't matter how everybody's graphs lined up. What mattered is then I could distill a conversation back at everybody that everybody felt like reflected what we discussed. And it was just really great. It was like such an important part of where we landed. The other piece that I think is a big part of animation direction, but sort of executing then on this vision that you're able to talk about together. If you're able to align on this and say, yes, these are, all of us agree that these are the words that describe the thing that we want, is then about actually starting to bring those elements in as animators. So animation, leadership, and direction, I think, is a lot about that sort of initial vibe check. But even like in like these sort of, we have to bring others on this journey. Starting, I think, too early with this kind of stuff, especially in R&D land, projects in R&D can get derailed if you're starting to focus on these things too early. When you actually start executing on these things, how do teams know that it's the right time to actually start doing that kind of stylistically intentional animation? Do you know how to start directing a team of like, how do you know that these things aren't going to get immediately ejected into the sun by design tomorrow? When do you start bringing style into the process?
So like for me, things become real when they're in game. So like the sooner you can start testing these in prototypes within the like things that are being asked from design, the whatever feature you're working on, right? That's where it's going to prove it out, right? So I think this is why I think like the style stuff is like chapter 7, right? And it's like the first 6 chapters are around like okay, what's the expectations of your role? What are the project's needs? What are the tech needs? What are what's the team structure? What are possible team size? Like all of those are things that to me you sort of need to understand up front before I even really start to get into style, because those things you're going to get a better understanding of. Okay, well, what tools do we have? Because if we want to go for something more realistic, do we have the tools and the pipeline and the tech and the people available for that stuff? If we want to get like some sort of really interesting shader stuff in game and playing around with like wild motion smears and all of these sort of things, like, cool, do we have the tech for that? Do we have people that understand this stuff? All of those are the sort of things to me that are like, get that foundation, get some of that understanding, because that's going to start to influence what your style is, and also where you can start testing and applying some of those style choices in game to see how it works, right? So for me, it's like, early on, one of the first things when I joined on Agents of Mayhem was, hey, we know jumping and it's going to be a big thing. And it was like, I want to get in there early and start influencing. If we want something other than a simple parabolic curve, we need to get something to get people excited about this now, and do some animation tests and start doing stuff there that is going to get people excited about something snappier versus something more realistic and standard. So I think that's when you try to start to use, okay, we want a style that we can push a little bit beyond what Volition's previous games had done. Here's a feature that we know is going to be worked on first. Let's show how it works there, apply it to that, start getting in game and driving things that way. Then you can start seeing that play out and where it pushes and evolves throughout the rest of the process. So, I guess it's never too early, but you need to make sure that you can't just also be like, we're going to do this wild abstract style. And you're like, well, you clearly didn't listen to the project needs and expectations or understand what your pipeline and tool set is, because that isn't reasonable.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sky.
I was just going to chime in and say that I think one of the interesting things that we did in our project is, while we did that, more like intense style calibration now, like more recently, to kind of like align around a very specific style, it's not like before that we didn't have any idea what we wanted to do for the style at all. We actually had a few like interim steps, like when Lana joined the team, you and I like worked together on a sort of like, I don't remember what we called it, but it was basically a stopgap style. I think our director had some name for it. I don't remember what it was. It was like, basically it was like first pass style. And the intent of that was like, hey, we're not ready right now today to like figure out like the style, the capital style for the game, but we need to have some direction with like what we are making now to be able to like kind of get us in that direction. And that was kind of interesting to do, because we weren't like really trying to land on something that was like hyper specific, but more like, what is like the general like vibe we want to get out of the game. And that was really nice, even though we weren't ready to execute on like style direction for the game, to have a sort of like interim space to work in. And it provided like, I was talking earlier about bounds. It provided like a pretty big box. It wasn't like super narrow, but we were able to then do like every animation we did. We were like, well, it's got to be in this big box, but maybe I'll try this one that's like a little over here, and then a little over here, and then a little over here. And it allowed us to try to then like experiment a little bit, but within the bounds of like a sort of like style gesture that we were going for. And I think that that's a great way, if your team's not like ready yet for the big like capital S style for the game, to at least try to like give them something, some kind of like nugget or some kind of bounds to work within. I really enjoyed that, because as like someone whose job it is to kind of like I'm sort of like the top level IC who's like supporting the director to get to the style. It allowed me to like generate a lot of nuggets. And sometimes I'd be like, what do you think about this, Lana? It's like really squishy. And she'd be like, no, we're not doing that. Even though it was like within that box that we made, it was like not the right one, right? And so anyways, I just wanted to call that out because I thought that was something nice that we did, even though our team wasn't really ready, like you talked about, to do like the real version of the style.
I like that as well. I'm gonna try and pull in I see there's these great questions in chat. I'm gonna try and pull them in when they seem relevant to what we're talking about. Big B808 asks, is animation typically the aspect that has to compromise to match the overall style or vibe of the project? And I think in a world where you're not doing what, like the things that Skylar or Mike said, in the sense of like, you're not getting in there, you're not trying to put your hand on a vision and show people what to be excited about, it very well could be, but it certainly does not have to be. And I certainly think it shouldn't be. Ideally,
Well,
if you've got like a director who's in there trying to be a part of what your game needs to be. Sorry, Skylar.
Well, no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to say that, like, I think it's interesting because I've worked on like games where it like what it was because of the needs of the game. And I think there's always this tension for animation specifically around like how sort of like design driven versus like animation driven is your game. And I mean, I think of League of Legends, and it was very interesting that like the style was compromised a lot, and still I think it is like the choices around animation are sometimes just like, well, you just can't do the style because they need it to be like competitively perfect in a lot of ways, right? And so it is, depending on the type of game you're working on, particularly these like really like hyper competitive like PvP games, often animation does have to make a lot of compromises around style. But then you get to the other end where they could see you're working on like a narrative game, and there I'd be like, yeah, no, like animation should be like, you should be driving like the everything, really, you know? And then there's these games, I think where it gets really, really hard is like the games that are somewhere in between, because it's just like, you know, I play games, and the choices made around like how much is animation compromising for gameplay versus gameplay pushing animation. I'm often surprised at some games. I think a game that's like kind of interesting for that aspect is like the Witcher 3 games, which like kind of seem like at first like they're gonna be these games that are all about like gameplay and cool magic systems, but then in the end of the day they're like a very sort of animation driven kind of like sluggish game where design takes like a second seat. So I don't know, I know that's like a little bit blabby about just like reminiscing about the whole concept, but I think it depends a lot. I mean, I think it depends a lot on the needs of the project, and some games really are just like animation does have to kind of take a back seat and be the one that compromises. And I think part of your effort as an animator, and particularly a director on the project, is to figure out what is needed for your project and what's good for it. Because I've also been on projects where the art directors pushed like animation style in ways that was like not good for the gameplay because they didn't want to compromise. And so I think that there's like a maturity and an understanding of that tension. And to Mike's earlier point about like asking a lot of questions about what the team needs, that's really important, because I think you could easily, as an animation director, like push a team in like a direction that's not good for gameplay if you're not willing to compromise some to design and the mechanics of the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for the big thing for me there is like, in asking those questions, you want to try and find those constraints early, and like, what is the project? What are the needs, right? Because, you know, oftentimes it'll be like, oh, the constraint is that it has to be immediate or has to be responsive. And so that means animation has to compromise. And I think if where it's worth spending the time thinking about all this stuff and doing it as early as possible and asking these questions is to find what those needs are, find what those constraints are, because I think a vision like establishing a vision the same way, and that making an animation this has a vision defined for you, is knowing those constraints and then being able to meet those constraints in a way that is compelling and appealing, and has intent. And like, to me, intent is the biggest thing, because you can have like, I think fighting games to me are one of those great instances where you can have characters that have a 3-frame, like on frame 3, they've got to have their hit out, right? And like, it's fast, but it doesn't feel compromised, right? Because the animators understood the assignment. There was clear metrics and definitions from what the design needed. and they understood who the character was and were able to build it out in such a way that in total it feels great. And you know when you play a fighting game that doesn't do that well because it doesn't feel good, and maybe individually some animations look better, but it doesn't actually come together. So for me, the biggest thing I think is if you don't get to spend the time early figuring the stuff out, and there isn't the space given to set and define these things, then you're going to get to a point where everything downstream, animation, VFX, audio, lighting, everyone ends up having to compromise because there wasn't clear definitions up front of what is the game, what are the metrics, and what is the vision that's going to match those and be ready for those. Then everything sort of makes me sad because I don't think these things have to be separate from one another. I think everyone can come together to make a great.
I think that's one of the things that sort of is sticky to me about the comment is if it's that intent. If it is considered as a part of what you are trying to create when you are thinking about the style you're aiming for, it is not a compromise. It is a piece of the style that you need to execute on. So one of the things that it can be connected to style. It's definitely like a big part of animation, and it is something that, depending on your game type, is there's like I feel like every topic we have, there's like a wide pool of like, oh, you could do anything here, but it is about that performance, that intent that you're going in with. One of the things that I really like in your book is you separate out, I believe, emotional performance and physical performance, because there are lots of games that have cutscenes and they have emotional performances, and there are tons of games that do not, and it is purely a physical performance, or sometimes that emotional performance has to be part of the physical performance. But I think this is the really interesting part. There's a lot of like technicalities and like asking those questions and building your team, and we're not even touching today really about like management and what that actually looks like in the role of a director, etc. Like there's all those pieces we're not really talking about, but the really sort of fun thing, though it's all fun in its own way, is finding that performance and approaching that performance in a way that is unique to your game. I know this is like the sentence I keep saying. One of the things I really like in your book, but I can't so sue me. That's what we're talking about, baby. That's what the book's about. But the thing that I like is that you identified, and maybe I'll just try and find a way to ask you about it rather than tell you about what you wrote, but it's talking about identifying a vision for the performance, the physical performance, not by necessarily like tight references, but by like identifying motion styles that have similar, like my English language is failing me, that have similar ways of moving. Some is staccato, some is flowy. Maybe there's arcs, and Skylar will love them. But identifying things that are similar by way of the type of motion, and not necessarily a tight reference to a specific fighting style or a specific acting choice. Can you talk a little bit more about your approach to like finding the heart of what makes compelling performance? Just tiny question there.
Just a tiny. This is all. Yeah. So, let me see. So I think let me roll back to the like. I do love the idea of breaking it down between a performance being driven by either emotion or physicality, that's something that exists in acting. For me, Ed Hooks was the one who has been gracious enough to spend time chatting with me about this stuff a number of times. And for him, it even goes back to coming from Stanislavski, who started the system that then became method acting. And really what this is even just sort of Stanislavski's evolution of the system, in that early on, the idea of creating this was that up to that point, acting, which was all in theater, was very gestural. And the way that they would sort of act on stage was similar to a language, and that this pose meant this emotion, and this pose said they were going to do this thing, right? And so trying to come up with something that was more of a believable, realistic, grounded experience was what they were going for, and where the system came from, and that was really driving from the idea of commit to what is the authentic emotion of the experience, of the moment, of the character, which I think is what still then when it comes across to the States, and Strasberg picks it up and turns it into method acting, sort of turns to the idea of like become the character. If you are the character, you are true to the moment, true to the emotion, then whatever you do is correct, right? And so that's sort of thinking of it in that very specific emotional place. That I think that a lot of times when people think about acting are thinking on some scale and some range in that space of understanding the mindset of the character.
Method animating, yes.
Method animating. But even then, right? Like just that idea of like let me commit to the feeling, the space, and when you work with it's sort of also the difference between when you work with dramatic actors versus say stunt actors when you're directing mocap. You're working with dramatic actors, and a lot of that is them asking questions of, okay, well, what's my relationship with this character, and what was I doing before this, and what did I have for lunch today, and what mood was I in, and like all of these sort of things, because they want to understand the psyche and the moment of the character to give you that authenticity, right? And so I get into that stuff there as well, and I love that stuff. But then I think then to the physicality side, right, which is what you're talking about, where I think a lot of the times as animators we have principles that we fall back on, or we say things like that should be punchy, make that heavier, or can that just look cooler? And we sort of have these things that aren't necessarily clear. And talking with some dancers, there's already something out there that does this called Laban movement analysis, where it's coming from the dance and sports and things like that, where you have somebody that said, can I break down motion through a series of symbols to dictate how this thing will work? And sort of in the same way that someone will compose music with notes, can I compose motion with symbols, is what Laban movement analysis is essentially trying to do, which is great. And I really enjoy it. And it's not that I think I'm smarter than them, because I'm not. They're much smarter than me. But they do have words in there like jab and punch that, especially in games, are kind of loaded terms, but actually just sort of actions that are asked for kind of regularly. So it gets to that point of like, let's come up with something that we can use to speak to this animation, to try and get some consistency in how the character is moving, without falling into the same things that we've seen a million times, right? So the idea of fluid and staccato, contained and broad. Even with just those two, if you say, okay, this character over here is contained and staccato, and this character moves fluid and broad. Now, just the way that those two move, I don't necessarily need any to think about their psyche and their emotion and all that stuff. We're going to attach some of that, but just seeing those two movements comparatively to one another, they're going to stand out and they're going to feel unique to each other. As you add in more elements like a high stance versus a low stance, effort versus effortless, active versus still, and you start mixing and matching all of those things, and you say this character is these 4 or 5 elements, and this character, or this faction of characters, because we know we're going to have, say, maybe similar archetypes, but we want factions that sort of sit above it, right? So this faction always moves like this, and we know there's, say, a melee and a ranged and a support somewhere in there, but their movement elements are all this. Cool. The way that melee faction character with those motion elements moves is going to be different from this one. So even if their abilities are sort of the same, it's another way to help immediately identify and communicate what makes this character, this performance different and stand out from this character over here that sure maybe also has a silhouette and unique VFX and unique audio, but the more we can communicate visually in all of the different forms that we have is really what helps to sell. Oh, that feels unique. That is, I'm attached to this character in a different way than I'm attached to this one.
I love the vernacular because it is something that you can use as like the starting point for finding a unique identity, but it's also something that you can use to discover what you think is cool or interesting, starting with a piece of reference, whether that piece of reference is another game that you really like and you're like, oh, what is it about this that feels so interesting to me, or like a specific video clip. Like, it doesn't, just because we're using those words to describe like motion, and I think animation, a lot of times I think you're thinking about the animation principles. It's like motion is the world. It's like, it's what grounds it and what makes something special and unique. And sometimes finding those really juicy pieces of reference that you're like, oh, this would be so sick to do this X, Y, or Z in a thing. You'll show it to somebody else and they will not understand what you think is cool about it, or they're going to identify something else. And so being able to pull a piece of reference and being like, I like this because it is fluid but contained. Like the way that you can start using that language, just start developing, it really does feel like another language almost that you'll start speaking amongst your peers if you're able to get on that same page about it.
Yeah, and it helps too to be like, especially as it comes in this direction, somebody will come up and you'll be like, I'm excited, I want to do this thing with this character. And unless you've sort of taken some time to understand and develop this stuff, they'll show up and be like, yeah, that is cool, but it's not right for this character. And if you've already spent time together talking about this, be like, you know what, that is cool. I don't think it works in this character in this space, but do you know where something like that could work? This character, or this movement, or this faction, or this feature, or whatever. It helps, right? And that ideally, you know, what I try to do on a lot of the teams and projects I work on is I want us to be open to be able to do everything, but I want to sort of carve out those quadrants where each character, faction, person, whatever, gets their piece that's unique, that defines them. And once we know that, we can say, all of that's theirs. And if you want to do that stuff, this character, this thing is perfect for you. If you want to do this other thing, okay, yeah, we can figure out how to do that over here. But it's got to be over here. And maybe that's on this project, maybe it's a future project. But at least it helps to clarify that so that people don't just get frustrated and be like, well, I thought it was a cool idea. And it's like, well, it was, but now we understand why and where it fits.
Yeah.
So when you're approaching that with the team specifically, I'm talking about like starting to branch out and figure out like what is the motion variety that like makes the different characters, factions, and whatnot in your game unique. How do you go about deciding like what is flexible per character and faction versus things that are like motion pillars of the game that need to be true of everything? Because I think of like fluidity as an example of a thing that could be like, hey, we've made a decision about like how fluid animation is in our game, and that's like a pillar, right? But then you could also look at like a per faction like character and be like, oh, it feels like this character would move in like a really fluid way. And like at what point does that become like a thing that's flexible like per faction versus like a thing that's like a pillar of the game? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Like,
yeah, that's because I feel like one of the things that I'm like clarify, like one of the things that I'm always challenged with on a project is that frequently I've been on projects where we come up with like the style for the project, and then what we run into is that we really try to like stick to those pillars, and things across the whole game become kind of samey because we aren't quite sure where like we can pull the levers of flexibility. So do you have any like thoughts around that, having, you know, like worked in those areas a lot and trying to figure out like sort of specific faction identities and stuff for motion?
Yeah, so I think the fluidity is a great specific example, because there's the fluidity of motion, then the fluidity of how things chain together for a good feel, right? And so there's always a good conversation in when we talk about fluidity as a project. Are we talking about actual fluid motion, or fluidity of how we can move through all of the actions that are available to the character, right? Because that fluidity could be as much on the system side as it is the motion. But let's say that we know that this is fluidity as a motion is meant to exist for every character. That is just the high level, the high level vision that fits within motion for the game. That means, okay, cool. We know everything fits there. What are elements that we can use to differentiate while still maintaining fluidity, right? And so if essentially we know fluidity is the motion element of style, that means, and it starts to pull in timing a little bit as well, right? Then we're going to have to play with posing a fair bit more to really make sure that we're standing out in those ways. And then in that, how do we differentiate and clarify sort of those constraints on the pose? Because you're probably going to have to be even stricter on things like posing to get differentiation than you would be otherwise if you have, fluidity isn't that overarching one. Because I think that's ultimately what it always comes down to is finding those constraints that say this is what makes this character, this person, this thing unique. And as soon as everyone has it, then it stops making that less unique, right?
Yeah, it's like Daredevil. It's like if you can't see as your through line that's through the game, you got to like bring your other senses up to like differentiate the where you're allowed to be flexible, right?
That you just do see, right? Like,
yeah.
So I think that's the thing too, right? Where it's that's also where I think ideally you would figure that out early when you're talking in the project to go, okay, let's have a conversation about this, because you asking for fluidity means that we're going to sort of get samey animation, in which case then physical driven performances might not be where you want to go with it. It might be that you want to go with it more towards that emotion personality driven side of things, right? Because the way a fluid clumsy person moves is different than a fluid efficient person moves, right? And so you can find other ways of meeting that, but pulling in and making each character, each thing its own.
This is connected, but definitely an aside. I just saw today, I could not tell if it was a joke video or not. I assume it's not. Just thinking about like a fluid clumsy person versus a fluid not clumsy person. Has anybody seen liquid parkour?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. It's basically people like flopping around and flopping over buildings and flopping over, but like with grace. It's still parkour, but you look like you're just flopping around the world. It's like that would be
ragdoll parkour.
Yeah, it's so ragdoll parkour. Yeah, it's so silly looking. But yeah. I love that. Just looping it back into what we're talking about. The second that something is constrained, if everything is constrained, then maybe that's a space where you're like, animation isn't a big ask for a project. Maybe we should be asking, is animation even right for this? In what way? Maybe we're looking at 2 frames here, and maybe we shouldn't be even looking at doing a 3D thing. Like that would go back to the zoomed out picture of the universe of what does animation even mean to this game, versus okay, we know we want to lock in on fluidity and finding the thing that becomes boundless because we found a constraint. And a lot of time having those tight connections with your collaborators, maybe it's that we have absolutely insane costumes. Maybe everybody has a color that's fully their own. Maybe they have an audio profile that is fully their own. There's some other way that uniqueness, I think, if uniqueness of characters tied with a consistent through line is a part of your game, it will explode out somewhere in order to find what it is. And I like that as a visual in my mind. So one of the other big parts about directing for animation that honestly I have yet to really need to dive into. Well, before that, I'm going to pull a question from the chat, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about performance and acting, because that is not something it's been a minute. But before that, thinking about animation style and like finding these directions. We're locking in on fluidity. That's the common thread. Aramil asks, perhaps this is answered in the book, but how much of animation style is up to the direction/team and how much is dictated from a production staff? Like, presumably there's a target genre or demographic that the company is working towards. So through our conversation, who is deciding fluidity? That's the key.
So I think some of that's going to depend on like the team structure, when you're joining. Maybe you have a creative director who's very driven by that. Generally every studio has slightly different hierarchy in maybe what area, maybe it's tech, maybe it's design, writing, art, whatever that's sort of driving what the vision of the game is. So some of that stuff can come, say you get hired in and you get moved on to a project and you've sort of already defined that high level vision with that thing. It could be coming from creative director or design director that said fluidity and meant that for responsiveness, and you don't know, right? So you have to ask that stuff, but then I do think there becomes a certain point where, back to that point of intent, we have an expertise in animation that it is related to art. It's for years fallen under the art umbrella. It is it's an area that we are very closely aligned with in terms of visual communication. But I do think there also becomes a thing where a lot of animation style and vision in games can sort of start to feel repetitive. And I think it's a mix of not given the space to discuss this stuff early, and then also sort of falling into, oh, well, this thing changed, and I just need to come up with something immediately. So I'm going to take, what was the last thing I saw that probably inspired me, whether it was an animation, a film, somebody else's game, like whatever that just sort of sticks in your head. You go, I need to solve this now. I'm going to solve based on my specific interest of the moment, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we sort of start to get in this cyclical thing of just content swelling that we just can't help but get sort of sucked into. So I think all of those are like production, design, all of those are great places to have some metrics and to help establish sort of your constraints and what resources you'll have and how much attention and time and focus you can put to these things. But there's always some good amount of valuable tension in saying, but what if we pull a little bit, like if we go this way, it's going to help us stand apart. I know you want to make a competitor to this other game or this type of experience, but if we do this, it can help make ours stand out a little bit and maybe grab eyeballs, grab attention. And as long as it doesn't come or come at the detriment to or sacrifice a need of the game, then go for it.
I think animation is in like a pretty unique spot in that it can often be sort of a hub for a lot of other disciplines. And so I think because it is like just, one art form, and like there's character art and there's VFX and there's audio, there's like all these different pieces. Take what I say with a grain of salt because we know we're animators here, so maybe this a little bit inflated. But I do think that there is like a big potential for animation to be a driver in the space. And so I think like ideally in the world that we're looking at, coming from being an individual contributor and moving into a leadership or direction space, there could be this expectation of like, well, the game director, somebody, the creative director, the designers, they need to tell me what they need and we'll just make that. But exactly what you're saying, Mike, I think there's massive potential for animation to push a game beyond what it thought it was going to be just by the nature of where the craft sits in relation to the other disciplines. End of sentence. So one of the things I want to talk about, because I do think it is something I haven't had to experience as a director yet, and it is a massive part, is more that emotional performance. there's a bit of a difference. Mike, you have worked in mocap, so actually directing actors on set, not just their physical performances, but needing to hear what their character's backstory is. Like, even the way you talked about that, if somebody asking you those questions, I'm like, who would ask me those questions? And I'm like, oh yeah, mocap actors, but I don't work with mocap, so I don't know. But there is a massive part of being a director in that space that is, I always say, very thespian. And I how do you get into that headspace of working with people? How do you bring vision? It doesn't have to be about mocap, but like specifically that more acting, more thespian space. I don't even know how to touch on the question because I'm not even like engaged with it. But when you're like bringing the vision together and finding these unique moments that are touching and live emotionally within the world of a character, how do you get there, something out of nothing? And then how do you bring other people into that and feeling that? Because in a way, each animator working on a piece of content has to be able to direct themselves in that same way.
Yeah. So it's always interesting. One of the things I love to do is try to give everyone on a team that I work with the opportunity to direct some motion capture, because the way, again, like, it works really well when animators are working with stunt actors, because stunt actors, like, they think in movement as well, right? So you say, I need you to move back, like, you take a hit and move back 3 meters. Got it. And they understand that way of thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Generally, when they land, then you're going to get video gamey this, right? And so you've got to sort of, okay, well, let's, try and get into it a little bit more staccato, or really plant and hit heavy and don't, hold it, try and be still, or exaggerate even more, right? Like, you can sort of talk. So starting with stunt actors is sort of a good way of doing it. But when you start working then with more dramatic actors, right, where they're coming from that space of who is this character, and every I learned this from Ed. I don't know where he picked it up. It might have been his own, where you don't want to start a scene at the beginning of the scene, right? Like, or a shot, you're not starting it at the beginning of it. You want the character already mid-action, they're doing something else, and then you sort of pick it up. There's a before and an after that you sort of have to apply, because that's what gives them life. And when you're working with actors, that's the thing that they're always sort of thinking about is, okay, well, what am I doing before? What was I doing before I got here? What was I doing after this thing, right? And so for them, it's generally the definition of acting that Ed uses, I love, is that it's an action in pursuit of an objective, overcoming an obstacle. So if you can give an actor and say, okay, here's your objective, here's your goal. And I mean, it's sort of like the player experience, right? Like, here's what you're trying to achieve, right? And this is the obstacle. This is what's in your way. It could be a person, it could be an object, it could be themselves. That at the very start, and then whatever they give you, right? That's the action. And I think, again, for animators, we're always thinking of that action. Like, that's our default state, is that action. And so you have to, again, be able to sort of like not be as precious about the action, and think about, because an actor isn't a rig that you can pose around. I think of one of the first times I directed mocap, and thankfully it was another animator in the suit, or else I would die of embarrassment right now. I was like, can you just lift your arm? And I just grabbed his arm and like lifted it up, and it got wet, and he understood. But I was like, oh my God, you don't want, like, you do that to an actor, be like, what? Don't, like,
don't touch me.
This is my tool. You're wanting me to, yeah. But that's the thing, like, you have to, it's a different way of approaching, right? Because acting on stage, on set, is a performance of the moment, whereas for animators, acting is a performance over time of minutes, days, hours, weeks, whatever, that we have to understand. And it's a different way of, again, zooming in and zooming out as to how you're going to get that performance.
So balancing, like, because I've definitely, I've had my like thespian moments. Like when I'm animating, I don't not think about those things. And when I talk about it, like I remember once somebody was talking to me about, or no, I was on Reddit for an AMA. Nobody's talking to me. I was on the internet. I was doing like a Reddit AMA for Heroes, and somebody said, "Oh, what's like an animation that you like?" And at the time, it was like clinical. He's gonna face this way, and then he's gonna face the other way. But here's why. And I like thought about it. When I described it to someone, they were like, "Wow, that's like a sentimental moment." It was for a character Stukov, and he has like a big monster arm, and I had him stand with it away because he's sensitive about it. He doesn't actually. He thinks he's a monster. He doesn't want to have this. He's trying to be this general. He has like his pride, but not his pride, like his composure to uphold. It like means a lot to him. He's a military guy, right? But in the end, he's a military guy. He will use anything at his disposal to get the job done. So when he enters his ready state, he shows that he's got his disgusting arm and is there. And it's not like it's really hidden. It's just like a thing that I had the character thinking about. And what I think is interesting about directing, especially with actors, as an animator, I feel like I'm trying to retain the character in my own head and trying to think the character's thoughts and be that as the animator. But then in directing, you also have to direct someone to feel that. How much of other people's feelings and the way they're embodying it, a part of your vision, like a part of your, like, creating and crafting a vision. Okay, we've crafted this vision. We want it to be fluid. We want it to be this. How much of what fluidity means to your game is because of the way a person moved, because of the way that it was embodied, because of the way the animator thought about it and spit that out. Like, finding a vision is not just your vision. It is your vision as expressed by the people you're directing. And how much do you think about that when just starting out making the vision?
Yeah, I mean, I think you certainly, when you're taking, like, with the vision, you're thinking of with your team, what are the project needs and all of that. And you're taking that into account. Once you start getting to the point of, okay, now we're going to do some capture. That's where you're getting to use the casting process to match what you need, right? Mm. And so, you know, if I'm looking for something fluid, I'm going to find people that are trained in specific forms of movement, of dance, of different martial arts that are going to naturally bring that, because their natural way of moving already embodies that. Mm. And then, so they're already going to get ideally within the mandate, within, if like you've got this slice of the pie that we have to live within, they're already in there. Now, maybe I was expecting over here, but they're actually closer to this side. It's okay. Like there doesn't, like, if what they're doing is they're delivering and they're hitting on that, and you know, you sort of need to, at a certain point, like, in the same way that I think when we say animators are suitable to help drive and move certain elements of game design and development beyond what we do. We have to portray that collaboration and give that collaboration back and outward as much as we're expecting it, mm-hmm. right? Because if not, then we're not really living up to it, right?
Yeah. So you can't necessarily cast your animators, right? You might be able to say, oh, these animators really want to animate this thing because they'd be more comfortable with it, like, but you can't cast your animators. So how do you give your animation team like notes on then how to like approach characters that they might not be embodying naturally?
Yeah, so that's where to me it comes down. I like making like personality videos and say, okay, let's get the animator, let's get the writer, who are the people that are going to be working on this character together, and let's find some reference points. It could be from film, it could be from different TV shows, fiction, nonfiction, like reality, like whatever, and say who are the reference points of characters that we think could work here. And then I like to cut like a 30-second, 45-second, like supercut, It says like this is who this character is, because it's creating one of those like sort of ripomatics early allows, again, everyone to kind of align around reference points. Maybe it's a TV show somebody hasn't seen before, so it's like, cool, go watch that show, right? Like you're going to start to get an understanding of who this character is, and as well as just get people excited and talking about maybe something outside of the game that they're both interested in now. I've also found that that's also helpful when looking, like bringing in like stunt actors that need to do some acting as well. If you have those little videos, you can say this is sort of the character and personality. Generally, stunt actors and dancers and things are pretty great at being able to sort of replicate motion and replicate performances. And you're likely going to then, you need to be careful not to fall into a trap of like, oh, I'm going to show him like Indiana Jones, then everything you get is just going to be Indiana Jones from that person. So you need to find enough counterpoints so that they sort of have to not fall into generic archetype. But I do think that helps in getting something early so that, again, people don't fall back to whatever they just generally are interested in and what their general choice and taste is going to be.
Yeah, I love one of the things that you have done is you make the character sheets for the characters, almost like a like something I would see like a stat thing on the back of like a Marvel card or something from my youth, where it's like, here's like this is how, or like a card game, like this is their steering, this is its power, the torque or whatever. But you've made those for your characters to make sure that they avoid that like tropey sort of archetypical. They sort of can start with an archetype, but then there's like a niche to the role. Can you talk a little bit more about like what somebody would bring? What is a character sheet and what would you put on it in order to really stick the landing?
Yeah, so we made those for Agents of Mayhem. The original mandate there was like, hey, we want to make like 100 playable characters. And it was like 30 playable characters. And it was like, well, okay, great. We'll need to figure out how to make those. But we would have, sometimes it would be like there's a cool piece of concept art and then people would write a backstory. And sometimes it was just a big backstory that somebody had written multiple pages of. And what can easily happen is, oh, here's a page on Wiki. Here's a backstory of a bunch of different pages. And how do you create something that people can look at and almost immediately understand who this character is or what it is they need to sort of hit on consistently, right? And so for Agents, it was like, okay, what was some of the important things were like, what is like, I love talking about like what was their favorite type of music, because that one was immediately like when we would go to the mocap stage, you could put that on while the actor was doing it. That influences time and feel and tone and all of that different stuff. But then also like the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Are they going to be like a lot more like focused on like survival versus maybe they're more interested in like intellectual and self realization sort of stuff and everything in between. And all of these are sort of things that we could just very visually set out so that once you walk somebody through it once, hey, for every character, you've got this thing. And where those I think are really valuable are where you do have a project of a lot of characters, because what that's going to do is it's I remember, I think it was on the first Psychonauts, Tim Schafer said that he had created a Facebook page for all the different characters because it asked like, what's your favorite cereal? What's your favorite background? Like all of these things that defined sort of what a person's interests were, right? But it was understood and it was sort of set, and it helped you just to get a better understanding of who this character was pretty quickly. It wasn't necessarily going to, like with these one sheets, you're not going to get a ton of depth to them. But in the case of like, hey, I'm playing as this character for a couple of minutes or a few, whatever, then I switch to another character and then another character. I think that stuff really sort of works. But then, like, say, moving to a narrative game, like when I went to BioWare and you've got characters, you've got less characters, but you're going to spend hours, hundreds of hours with people, then that's where, okay, you could try and make one of these, but like it takes a little bit of time to figure out what is all the necessary information for a template for one of those sheets.
Mm-hmm.
And that's valuable if you're going to do a bunch of them. But if you're not going to do a bunch, then it's probably better to divert that time into what's unique about this character and creating those videos and things that give a little bit more breadth of breadth and depth versus like this immediate flash of, here I am.
I think one of the things I really like about the character sheets, or something that I was thinking about, is, you know, we talk about this physical performance and like what makes something unique. Oh, it's you know, it's got the, what was the word? The fluidity, but it's contained. Like, oh, that's a unique thing on fluidity versus like a boundless fluidity, a Kingdom Hearts sweeping around doing all crazy stuff all the time. Like that's what like gives it its unique profile. And I think a lot of times with acting, especially with animation in games, a character can be kind of one note, where it's like they are this thing. This is the hopeful person, and they're so hopeful, and they bring everybody hope. And this person is the angry person, and they're so angry, and then you'll know because they're got the angry eyebrows on. And one of the things that you listed on your character sheet that I feel like is not something we hear a lot talked about is a secret. What is something that character doesn't want other people to know? What is their insecurity, or I mean, it can be something that is like a deep insecurity that's not like necessarily about the game, or it could be something that's overt to the game. Okay, this character's insecurity is that they are, you know, using Stukov. He doesn't like that fact that he has a monster arm. That's like a thing. But then a character could also be like this. They're the villain eventually in the game, and they don't want people to know that they're gonna steal the heist money for themselves, like the Italian Job or like whatever it is. But having that contrasting beat to whatever their key tone is, I think is something that makes a character resonate, even in the acting choices they make, even if you are not doing an emotionally driven game. The way that they physically embody themselves, if everybody has a little thing about them, gives you an option for like functionally the type of emotes that they might do, the way that they express themselves, the way that they would carry themselves. I think having that opposing force to their main energy is something that adds a depth, and including that kind of thing on the character sheet, I think was like such a clutch addition. And as somebody, again, who doesn't really think about things emotionally necessarily, it just, I really love that as a detail.
Yeah, I think that was like, again, I love Ed Hooks. I think that I either got that from him, or it was certainly from some sort of acting, right? And yeah, it was always a fun thing to figure out too, because as you start to get into this archetype mindset, you drill down so far, and they go, okay, now what's this? And you go, oh, and generally you're trying to find even something that can contrast that or maybe subvert it a little bit. And it is just that beautiful little note that makes the team think of them as a little bit more than just one dimensional, and makes them human, right? Like everyone's not being 100% forthcoming about everything they are, why they're doing it. And yeah, it's great to sort of have that on there, so that I think the actors would also, when we would work with them on set, it was like, okay, you've never seen this character before, here you go. And they could have that. And it was just something that they could listen to an interview with Tom Hanks once saying he always calls about like always have something in your pocket. Like something that's just for you. Don't tell anybody else on set. When you're that character, it doesn't have to be a physical thing. Like I think Nicolas Cage actually did do, like you would, I think for Ghost Rider, like had different things you would like sew into the clothes and it was like physically on him. But yeah, I think it's just great to have those little things that can just help ground and keep you from falling into the same repetitive stereotype archetype thing.
Yeah.
How do you balance some of this like desire for specificity and like I mean, this is all like very inspirational to me, but a lot of the work I've done is like on games where you, the player, are not like a person. It's like you are like an avatar of the player, right? I mean, that's pretty different from like, oh, you're Nathan Drake or you're, you know, Kratos or you're whoever, right? Who have like a personality. Do you have any like sort of tips around this for like how to develop like a player character that's not like an individual? Because I have to find it's like really challenging because like you don't want to. It's funny because I remember way back in uh, uh, I worked on Project Copernicus, which was an MMO. It was like a fantasy MMO, and we didn't have any like specific style for like the player character, other than that it just needed to be kind of like generic because it needed to fit whoever. But then we did like a whole slew of emotes, and the character just kind of turned into this like sarcastic a-hole. And I remember the art director being like, why is our player character like a jerk? Like, why are you all animating him like he's just like a jerk? And it was just kind of like I guess it was a subconscious thing because we were all jerks. But
where you were just
know,
like frustrated in the fact that like there was
we
no
like
personality. I don't like
the,
working on this character that has no personality.
So like as someone who's like a little bit more in tune with the world of like acting and that kind of animation that I haven't had as much experience with, like do you have any thoughts around that space of that like sort of blank palette main character?
I mean, I think so, you know, having worked on Elder Scrolls Online, I mean there's a different one. Like that's another type of thing where the whole thing is more about giving players many choices as possible and being able to like respond to that choice, react to that choice, right? And so I think to me that's where trying to attach like that personality or emotional based performance on a character like that is sort of setting yourself up for frustration, right? That is to me where it'd be like, okay, let's go back now to what is the physicality style, right? That is going to help set this character apart, because maybe there's, depending again on team size and variety of actions and scope and all of that sort of stuff. You know, are there ways of setting a physicality style to a choice that the person makes in, maybe they choose a class, maybe they choose a background. Like in Elder Scrolls or Baldur's Gate, you can choose different races, and depending on your team size and scope, do they have a different physicality, right? Those are the sort of places where once you understand the project, then you can say where is there an opportunity to inject something more than vanilla, sort of generic base high fantasy or high sci-fi or standard sort of thing. You know, I think like there are some games where what you probably want to then focus on is more on that fluidity of how do all these things flow together, and supporting the fact that can you do anything at any time, and how do you do that well becomes, I think, then the interesting animation challenge, as opposed to I want this character to like have personality. I think the interesting thing then comes like, and now there's emotes, and it's like, okay, well, emote is emotions for a character that we're not conveying any emotion. That becomes a whole other thing of like, okay, well then emotes are maybe meant to be functional actions and less personality based, and so they're not really emote. But yeah, there's. Yeah.
Well, I like what you're saying about just sort of like you needing to offer then critical variety. So like the player's expression can be like, oh, I know what type of personality that you, the player, are applying to this because you chose to use those emotes. I think of Elden Ring. That game, at its face, is not a silly game. You're in a nasty world. Everything's gross. Everything's challenging. Like, whatever. But then through the notes and through like just that, the fact that one of the emotes is just being a ring is like, that is inherent. There's an inherent silliness that comes, that is embracing the community, even though the player character is like nothing, right? They're like They don't have a you pick one of your starting garbs, and whether or not you pick boiled shrimp as your starting item or whatever, or like, but it's not about like who you are is so much in just like the mind of the player and giving them the outlet. Sometimes you group up with somebody and they are using like the point, we're going this way. Their emotes are functional. Let's do this. Let's do this. Sometimes you group up with a person and they are naked and their name is Let Me Solo Her. And you're like, okay, great. And that, like that character has a personality. They've embraced that personality, the tools that you gave them. And thinking about the player in those spaces as another vector of what it means to have your vision. They are a partial owner. And so like they will make that vision to come to life in a way that you would never expect. And listening to them and leaning into that, I think will be a key part of bringing these characters to life in the type of game that doesn't have something narratively driven.
Yeah.
So for, we're coming up on time here for our little stream. We do have a couple questions from chat that I just wanted to roll through to sort of take us out, unless there's any. Well, I'll close us out the last pieces at the end, no matter what. Calvlath says, when you're approaching animating something that is more narratively driven, what are some core things that you'd want to nail planning wise before you begin?
What's the tone of the narrative, like, and what's the theme of the narrative, right? And those can be different, right? It can be a very serious topic that's trying to be discussed thematically, but the tone could be that it's silly or that it's very sad or whatever, right? And so I think understanding those early on is super helpful. Who are the main characters? Who are the characters that you need to spend the most amount of time developing? And who are like secondary, tertiary characters that might be really interesting, but don't fall into the trap of focusing on them too early, because there's a good chance story rewrites, they could get cut, their parts could get shaved down. Like, allow them to sort of percolate in the background a little bit. And then from there, I think it's like defining what are those key beats of those characters, either in those relationships or that hit on the themes of the narrative, and make sure that you understand how those are going to be communicated in the game. Are those something that are happening and driven by the devs through, say, a cutscene or taking control away from the player? Is it something that the player has agency in which case then understand what those verbs are and what those actions are that the player is going to have available to them, and make sure that those will work for those moments.
And one of the things I learned at GDC this year, check with your environment artists and make sure that the environments exist. Gosh, there's an anecdote is the Animation Friday Hour for free for visibility on the GDC Vault?
No, it is not, unfortunately.
Well, if anybody has Vault access, I recommend checking out the GDC, the Animation Variety Hour, which Mike put together, that has a section in it that is 3 things animators should know from different artists who are not animators: a UI artist, an environment artist, and
game design, mission designer. Yep.
Mission designer. It's a great segment. Definitely check it out. Anyway, Felicia, what are some ways riggers and tech artists are incorporated early on into the process of achieving a certain style? I'm going to throw this one at Skylar because I know you're super tight with tech on the team.
So the tech artists are my favorite artists. I mean, they're super involved. I mean, I often am like the first animator on teams, and so because I build like a lot of like prototype stuff. and generally it's just like me and a tech artist are like often the entire art team at first on a lot of the projects I've worked on. And so a lot of what we're doing early on in the project is just making sure that the rig can support like the direction that we likely want to go. Even early on, we're trying not to box ourselves into things is more the important thing, I think, in the earliest stages of the game. But, you know, on some of the projects I've worked on, you know, we've done a lot of exploration too on like, well, how do we want to handle like, if we wanted to do like smearing and stuff, like how would we handle that in the rig early on, and trying to make sure, at least early on in the project, my goal is like, try to make sure that we're prepared for whatever the style could be. So having an idea about what the bounds are, once again, or even very early on in the project, can really help me work with a tech artist to be like if we know from day one we're not going to be like doing cartoony smear things, like we're not going to spend time figuring out how to do like noodle rigs on our characters, right? But if that's something that is on the table, then we're damn well going to be figuring out how to be doing noodle rigs early on in the project to make sure that like when we have 3-4 animators who are then asking to animate in that style, that they're not struggling with it. So it's really, really integral to have those like tech artists early on in your team and be thinking about style from, you know, even the earliest parts. And you can really like paint yourself into a corner if you don't think about supporting these things down the road. I mean, I can't count the amount of times on projects where we've been like, oh, now we have to incur like a 4-month rework of our core rig because we want to support a specific thing for animation style, and it changes like the hierarchy of the rig, which means we need to re-export every single animation in the game, or we need to like retarget and rebake everything because we didn't like make a decision early on. Those kind of things like bite you like really bad down the road. So, you know, involving tech art as much as possible and having animators and tech art communicating very early on in projects, I think is like really, really important to the success of the project, and really important for not like crushing your timeline later with a bunch of like reimagining of how your like core character in your game like works and animates.
Yeah. Even if you can't like act on some of those things, having like individual test cases, knowing you're going to lean into it. Yeah. Big time. Mike, I don't know if you would have additional thoughts and like maybe coming into a team that's established, but like at a director level, if you is there a difference there if in a tech team has not been super well incorporated, how to like bridge that, or like what other ways sort of further down the road of a project is it important for an animation director to be connected with tech?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's a lot of the same thing, right? Where what I like to do is I know enough about tech to be dangerous, which means I like to make sure that I'm always double and triple checking with the tech and tech art team to be like, and programming team, like, hey, we want to do this thing. Do we have the tools for this? Is this available in our stuff, right? Because even to your point of, well, maybe one of the optimizations early on was that we're not exporting translation or scale on the joints, which means if we now want to do that, that's just going to like double, triple cost per animation, right? And well, great. That choice that you just said because I want it has now blown your runtime budget. So a lot of it is when you're coming into a team is saying, okay, let's sit down and talk about where it's at, what we want to do. Let's find some reference points and say, can we do that? Do we have this like the foundation to do that? If not, can we build it? How long would it generally take? Who are the people on the team that could help do that? All of those are sort of things that I have in the book of sort of a breakdown of, okay, once you've sort of got a video together of this is what we want to make, break it down with all of the tech people on your team and say, this is what we would need. This is what we have. This is who would have to do it. And that's when you find out, well, yeah, but then we're also going to need somebody from level art because how does like this relies on nav mesh, and maybe our nav mesh isn't automatically generated and it's all hand placed, which means now if you want to do this thing for AI pathing, you're now incurring a lot of costs on level art or level design because now they need to go in and by hand update nav mesh everywhere. And you're like, well, then I don't know if this is going to happen, and let me talk about what their other things are. So it's very much that thing of not coming in and assuming that you have the answer, but asking that question of how do we do this? Because the way it's built at one studio is in one engine and one tool set is not likely going to be the same as the next.
Well said. And then our sort of last question from the chat here that just popped up before I ask a closing question from Mike Lescue. How much of what's in Mike's book builds on top of what he has covered in his previous GDC talks?
It is a mix of some of those. Like the one sheets were part of Agents of Mayhem. Just sort of looking at the stuff I have there. A lot of it was stuff that I feel like started in Agents of Mayhem and sort of grown and adapted past that. Since Agents of Mayhem, joining BioWare, getting to help set a vision on Dragon Age there, then moving to Compulsion Games, where there was already a strong vision on South of Midnight, but how do we execute and deliver on that was a different challenge, but it was interesting to be able to see how taking the things that sort of starting from scratch and building from an idea to fully realized can also help then say, oh, here's something that already exists, but how do I quickly define what's there, what's missing, what's extraneous that's cool but doesn't actually fit, right? Like I've said it a few times to people, more than a few times to people, like you come into a new project and generally it's like, oh, here's this interesting puzzle, and there's puzzle pieces everywhere, and it's like, how do you quickly get to a point that you can define this is the right piece for this puzzle or this isn't, so that you can find what are the actual pieces that we're missing here that we need to find.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, chat, Skylar, Mike, thank you so much for your excellent questions, your excellent discussion. My last question is, of course, if folks are interested in thinking, I might want to either be an animation director someday, or I'm an animator right now, maybe I'm looking to move into that right now. Do you have any hot tips for folks who want to get into that role? Hit it.
It's there. I mean, this is literally just my brain poured out across like 200 plus pages of things. Like, yeah, I'm proud of it. I think it's got a good starting point for probably all the things you're going to run into, so that hopefully you can help to define that puzzle piece, like figure out that foundation of stuff that we're talking about, so you can start getting into those, what I think are the more fun conversations of what is that performance, what is that style, how do we refine and push and get all of that stuff, because to me that's where I want to be spending my time. Like as a director, I want to be really getting in there and working with the team and crafting that overall experience. And really my hope is that the book helps everyone get to that point where they can be doing that thing and ideally seeing more and more interesting characters and performances and style and animation throughout more games.
Wonderful. So if folks want to keep in touch with you or follow any more of your goings on online, where can they find you at?
Lightbomb Mike, if you search that, you'll find it across all the different socials generally.
For those who are in our Rat Discord, in the announcement for this stream, I linked Mike's Twitter, so you can probably go there. I don't know if you have a link tree on there, but yeah, that's where you can find Mike. Skylar, do you want to do a quick little sign off?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of social media stuff, but you can find me on most games and stuff at Reach for the Skylar, and I do have a Vimeo page that has some fun stuff on it. I have some stuff on YouTube. If you search for Agora Studio and my name, I have a cool tutorial series about Unreal animation that I've been plugging for years. It's still relevant, it still works in UE5, so go learn Unreal 5 with that. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I work on secret stuff all the time, so I don't have anything to show.
Woo!
but it's fun.
Thank you so much, Skylar. Once again, my name is Lana Bachynski. I am at Latini, Latienie on all the social medias that you can find. I've got a link tree linked on my Twitter and Instagram. You can find the rest of the rats, and if you want to keep in touch with us, hear about future streams, I posted this in the Discord first, so the Discord is linked at the top here. I think it's also linked in our description on our Twitch page, so check it out. Aramil already on top of it. Rats in the chat for Mike Jungbluth, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And for the rest of you, expect more streams to come, baby. We're getting that affiliate status. We barely know what it means, but we want it so bad, and we're closer than ever. Rats, we love to see it. Thank you, folks. We'll catch you next time. And until then, rats.